so much for coming. I'm really, really excited for this talk. Our author comes all the way from New York to give this talk today. And we've got Mo at the back doing the live stream, so hello to people watching online. Please feel free to ask questions at the end. The talk will go on for 30 minutes, and then we have like 15 minutes for questions, and you can get your book signed afterwards. If you need to leave early, that's totally fine. Just quietly leave out the back there. So about our speaker, Mary Ann Trasciatti is a professor of rhetoric and the director of labor studies at Hofstra University in Hempstead, New York. She co-edited the collections Where Are the Workers? Labor Stories at Museums and Historic Sites, and Talking to the Girls, intimate and political essays on the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. So I'm going to hand over to Mary Ann. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Thanks to everyone on the live stream. I'm going to turn on the timer so I respect the time limits. So it's really great to be at Book Fringe at an independent bookstore and in the city that is James Connolly's birthplace. And thank you, Jim Slavin, for connecting me to this wonderful place and to the history. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn has a connection to indie bookstores. Her nephew, Peter Martin, was one of the founders of one of the best indie bookstores on the West Coast, City Lights Books in San Francisco. And she's also a person of letters herself, a prolific writer, and related to someone you may have heard of also, another prolific writer, George Bernard Shaw. She was also a really good friend of James Connolly and comrade, so I think there's a lot of karma to being here. I love the title of this presentation, Stories to Rebel Girl and Revolution, Stories to Inspire. I actually wrote this book because Elizabeth Gurley Flynn is nothing if not a rebel, and her life is nothing if not inspiring. And she deserves a much wider profile, and so I thank you for helping me to pursue that goal. So who was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn? I'm assuming you might know something, but there might be people out there who don't know very much. So I tell that story, answer that question in this book. And mine is a political biography, because Flynn was nothing if not a political animal, though there are details of her personal life woven in. But I tried to write her from the perspective that was most important to her, and that was politics. So I'm just going to introduce you to the writing. I'm going to be going back and forth here between speaking and writing. So here we go. In the summer of 1906, at the tender age of 15, Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, a member of the Socialist Labor Party, launched her career as a street corner speaker in New York City. I took to it like a duck to water, she recalled in her autobiography. No surprise there, Flynn's parents had joined the socialist movement when their firstborn daughter was young. Her American-born father worked in the quarries before studying engineering in Dartmouth, and that's in New Hampshire, and dropped out to become an itinerant mapmaker when his family could no longer afford tuition. Galway-born Annie Gurley worked as a seamstress until the second of the couple's 4 children was born. The Flynn family moved around several times before settling in New York. Poverty dogged them wherever they went. Flynn spent many hours at home and at countless meetings to which her father dragged her. Certainly didn't, she wanted to go, listening to conversations and debates about such topics as the exploitation of workers in various industries, union organizing drives, and the evils of imperialism, British and otherwise. These experiences and her encounter with books like Edward Bellamy's Looking Backward, combined with her family's poverty and the suffering she witnessed among the working class families around her, steeled Flynn's hatred for capitalism and formed her into a militant socialist with an internationalist outlook. Flynn's charisma and talent for debate, she won a silver medal in school, provided her the tools she needed to transform her political commitments into action. In no time, the supremely gifted teenage orator was drawing crowds wherever she spoke. It was not long before her speeches drew the attention of law enforcement as well. In August 1906, she mounted a soapbox to deliver a speech on women and socialism in New York's theater district. Before she finished the speech, police ordered her down from the makeshift platform and arrested her for speaking without a permit and blocking traffic in Times Square. The incident earned her the first of several nicknames, Daughter of the Reds, bestowed on her by fellow socialists. She did not object to the name. The red flag does not mean riot, bloodshed, and anarchy, she explained to a reporter with all the confidence of a precocious rising star in the movement. It means the red, healthy blood of the people. I am, in that sense, a daughter of the Reds, and I love, in that understanding, the red flag. So there's Gurley Flynn in a nutshell. She was a rebel, and she was an Irish-American rebel. And that's important for my telling of the story. She is part of an American socialist tradition. In the US, we define socialism as an un-American foreign ideology. But in fact, we have a very rich tradition, a bloody tradition, an admirable tradition, and Flynn is firmly rooted in that, so that's important to the telling. But the fact that she's Irish-American is also important to my telling. She was shaped by her Irish-American heritage. It shaped the way she looked at herself, and it shaped the way she looked at the world. Elizabeth Gurley Flynn made common cause with the oppressed everywhere. She was an internationalist, and this was not a matter of ethnic pride. She felt it was her responsibility as a person of Irish descent to basically make common cause with the exploited. Quote, Irish Americans should be naturally progressive, should never be guilty of race prejudice or political baiting, which their forebears in Ireland and immigrant parents suffered so deeply. So her experience were rooted in the, her politics, were rooted in the experience of growing up Irish American and poor, surrounded by poor people of all kinds. And that instilled in her a hatred for the idea that the many should suffer so that the few could prosper, and essentially molded her into a class warrior. And as you will have gleaned from the passage I read, her weapons were her talent for speaking, because she was an advocate of nonviolence. She did not support violence in the interest of revolution. So her weapons were a talent for speaking, fierce intelligence, she was brilliant, a sharp wit, she was Irish, and moxie, she was pretty brave. And people loved listening to her. I mean, there are accounts of people who heard her writing in their 80s and saying, I remember at that rally when you were railing against exploitative bosses and you raised your hand with the raised fist, and I thought, that's the most beautiful arm I've ever seen. Right? So the fact that she was young and beautiful also helped. But people really did love listening to her. Liberals, trade unionists, and radicals of every stripe. And she was invited by a theater producer at one point to become an actress. And she said, no, I won't read from a script. I'm in the labor movement, and I speak my own piece. In fact, that was the title of her first autobiography, which she hated. But we'll leave that for another day. Her first public speech was delivered when she was 15 years old on women in socialism, and followed by that soapbox speech. And she was, as I mentioned, called the daughter of the Reds. She was also referred to by the novelist Theodore Dreiser as the East Side, from the east side of New York, an immigrant neighborhood where she wasn't from, Joan of Arc, because she was young, beautiful, and leading a cause against a formidable enemy and inspiring the masses to go along with her. But the name that she's most often referred to as, and the title of the book, or part of the title of the book, is The Rebel Girl. Joe Hill, who was a Swedish immigrant, a wobbly, a poet, a songwriter, Joe Hill gave her that name before he was executed by firing squad in 1915 for a crime he almost certainly didn't commit. There's a lot of that in the U.S. labor movement, particularly the radical wing, people getting in trouble for crimes they almost certainly didn't commit. In his case, killing a grocery store owner and his son in Salt Lake City, Utah. That was in 1915. Flynn went to visit him in prison. The two had a connection. She advocated for his release, even got President Woodrow Wilson to the cause, but failed, and he was executed. Before he died, he either composed or completed the song The Rebel Girl, dedicated it to Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. If you've never heard the song, it's really great. I recommend the Hazel Dickens version. You may, though, have heard something else that Joe Hill penned, the expression, mourn, don't organize. Those were among his last words. So Flynn, like Joe Hill, excuse me? Oh, don't mourn, organize, right. Whoa, sorry, Joe Hill. A little bit of word salad there. So Joe Hill was a wobbly. Flynn was a wobbly. Who were the Wobblies? Flynn joined when she was 16 years old. The Wobblies, otherwise known as the Industrial Workers of the World, were, as the name suggests, an organization that aimed to organize all workers in all industries into one big union, a global union. And they were, in fact, a global organization, though founded in Chicago in 1905, so a very American organization. Just a collection of incredibly talented and audacious radicals. And they were syndicalists, too, which matters to the story. The Wobblies did not believe in participating in electoral politics. That was not the way to change the system. This was a revolutionary organization that wanted to overthrow capitalism and abolish the wage system and voting in elections, particularly when most of their members couldn't vote, because unlike the American Federation of Labor, the Wobblies organized immigrants, black workers, transient workers, and women. So the vote wasn't going to do it, but revolution on the shop floor was. So that was the organization that Flynn joined after the Socialist Party. She was really, really popular. Wherever she went as a wobbly, she would make headlines. She was a free speech fighter, and I'm going to say a little bit more about that. While pregnant, she was actually standing on soapboxes in cities like Missoula, Montana, Spokane, Washington, and then later on, Paterson, New Jersey. But in 1909, when she was pregnant with, she actually miscarried once and then had a son, Fred, she was participating. So that also made the news, that this young, pregnant radical, married to Jack Jones for a while, and he was born, so she left him. But that she would do this really made her kind of an anomaly and a really interesting figure. She also led some of the most famous strikes in U.S. history. If you've ever heard of the Bread and Roses strike, the Paterson Silk strike, the Mesabi Iron strike, that was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. And I shouldn't use the word led, because she never saw herself as a leader. She saw herself as a facilitator. As she said to the workers in Paterson, you're the I just make the record, but you're the song. Right? I'm just the phonograph. And she would fire up male and female workers wherever she went. She would call out bosses, politicians, and policemen who did the bidding of capital, especially if they were Irish, calling them things like fat Hibernian slobs, and et cetera, for doing the bid of capitalism rather than remembering where they came from. And she also would call out union bosses. And for that, the rank and file adored her. She quit the IWW in 1916. There was a controversy over how the union should reorganize itself and the work of defending wobblies who would get in trouble with the law. But she continued to organize. She basically remained a closet wobbly for the next 20 years. And she was particularly committed to organizing black workers. And this is at a time where that just wasn't a thing that was done, even in much of the labor movement. So I'm just going to read you a little bit about Flynn's work in 1919, so she wasn't officially part of the IWW, this during the first Red Scare at a meeting in Harlem. In November 1919, Flynn spoke in Harlem at a meeting called by the Committee of Justice to the Negro to protest the killing of more than 100 blacks during the Elaine Massacre. This was something that happened in Arkansas. Sharecroppers were trying to organize, and they were massacred by whites. And demand justice for the 12 African Americans sentenced to death for crimes related to the violence when no whites were charged. She was the last to take the podium, which means, of course, that she was the star attraction. She spoke against the legalized lynching of Arkansas farmers, exhorted black workers to organize, and urged white workers to welcome black fellow workers into their union. She drew upon her Irish ancestry and offered the experiences of migration and the struggle for freedom from oppression as a common bond between herself and the black workers in the audience, and by extension, all black and white workers. And here's a quote from her speech. We know because there was a guy doing surveillance there who wrote it all down. "We are gathered here together, liberty-loving, justice-loving men and women. It doesn't matter what the color of our skin may be. It does not matter from which corner of the earth we may have come. My ancestors came here willingly. Your ancestors came here unwillingly." Applause. "My ancestors came here because they were seeking from America what they could not find in Ireland at that time. Your ancestors came here in slavery and oppression, and we are standing here together today. The descendants of those pilgrims of days gone by, demanding the liberty that this country has promised the entire world. So we see here, I think, kind of a way out of the, at least in the US, the race versus class discussion, which has really polarized the left in recent years. So she's closet wobbly for about 20 years, and we'll get back to that period in a minute. In 1937, though, at the end of that time, she joins the Communist Party of the United States. And this was the Popular Front period, right, when the CP enjoyed, in the US at least, its highest level of popularity, allied with liberals in the struggle against fascism. And it was a perfect time for Flynn, because the CP was at the forefront of organizing industrial workers in the steel industry, in the auto industry, some of the great strikes of the 30s led by the Communist Party, the Congress of Industrial Organizations, and also fighting fascism. In fact, Flynn's first act as a communist was to speak on behalf of the volunteers in the international brigades in the Spanish Civil War, particularly the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, but generally everyone who had volunteered to fight against fascism. But Flynn didn't become an anti-fascist in the 30s. She was an anti-fascist when almost no one in the US who wasn't an Italian immigrant radical organizer was anti-fascist. I don't have the evidence for this, but she was among, if not the first, Anglophone anti-fascist in the US. When liberals were praising Mussolini for being this dashing figure who was getting those Italians in line, she understood fascism as a dangerous anti-democratic ideology, and in fact made an analogy between the KKK and the fascists in Italy, saying we don't need black shirts because we have white sheets. Right? So, and it's probably because of her relationship with Italian anarchist Carlo Tresca at this time that she saw the dangers of fascism, saw what Mussolini was doing to labor organizers and radicals in Italy, and made the connections here. But in any case, she was very often the only English language speaker at anti-fascist meetings throughout the 1920s. So the CP's commitment to anti-fascism would have really spoken to her. She got a lot of grief for joining the CP. Remember, this is the US, but she had no regrets. Even as her former allies among liberals and trade unionists abandoned her after the war, she remained a communist. In 1951, she was arrested for violating the Smith Act. The Smith Act was passed in 1940. It was first used against Trotskyists. They were ratted out by fellow union members and tried and imprisoned, and then used against communists less than a decade later. It was called originally the Alien Registration Act, and it's still relevant in the US. I'm sure you know that Donald Trump is rounding up immigrants as we speak, good people, working people, and he is using the 1940 Smith Act as justification for those roundups. So this law is still an issue. It was used in the 50s to destroy the Communist Party. Flynn was arrested in 51. She was part of the second group of communists to be arrested, so-called second string, which really bothered her. She didn't feel like she was second string. She wasn't. And convicted in 1953. And in fact, everyone who was arrested and went to trial was convicted. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and a really steep fine. And when sentence was pronounced, she said, and I quote, "My body can be incarcerated, but my thoughts will be free." She saw herself as a political prisoner. We do not recognize political prisoner status in the US. I don't know if you do here in Scotland, but Flynn had been fighting for that for a few decades by this time and was refused to acknowledge her behavior, her political activism as criminal behavior. It was politics, and she knew that, and that sustained her during prison. She had no regrets. She was 55 when she went to prison. She was very unhealthy, a bit overweight, remained unbowed, and remained a communist until her death. The invasion of Hungary didn't do it. Nothing drew her away. And you might ask why. Well, first, she was an internationalist, so she was inspired by what the party was doing or what the party had done against fascism. She was particularly inspired by the Italian and French communist parties and the leading role they played during the resistance. She was also inspired by her travels to communist countries and what they were achieving in terms of healthcare and education, racial justice and gender justice, which we weren't at that time in the US. And there were no other options. There was no other train leaving the station. in the U.S., and so she stayed with the party. So we can question her unwillingness or her inability to distance herself from some of the nefarious things that Stalin had done, and the Soviet Union generally, from the darker side of communism. But Flynn was no knee-jerk Stalinist, and she certainly was no authoritarian. And this is part of one of the things that I really work hard to accomplish in the book, is to explain Flynn as a lifelong fighter for freedom. Specifically, freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, the right to a trial by jury, what we call civil liberties in the U.S. Rights and freedoms granted to everyone, not just citizens, anyone on our soil, by the First Amendment to the Constitution. So, in my telling of Flynn's story, civil liberties is the thread that links all of the otherwise somewhat disparate elements of her activist life. And her approach, and this is important, was not a liberal one. Apologies to any liberals in the room, though I think they are given where we are. She did not see, as many liberals do, free speech as an individual right, as the sign of a sophisticated, free land, right? As an end. She saw free speech as a means. She saw civil liberties as a necessary precondition for collective action. To bring about a more just world. So free speech, free press, right to a trial by jury, that's the way we become, right, a just society. That is not a sign that we are a just society, it's a sign that we have the potential to be one. So why? Well, without civil liberties, there's no collective action. No demonstrations, no strikes, no pickets, no meetings, no organizing drives, right? No place to organize. If you are denied the right to organize or to speak, which means the haves will always rule over the have-nots. So Flynn's career is essentially one long fight for civil liberties. When she was a member of the Wobbly, as I mentioned, the free speech fights, she was championing the rights of any person to speak publicly on the streets, on the sidewalks, in public spaces, to rent a hall with a pro-labor message in communities where that right had been abridged. Towns like Missoula, Spokane, Paterson, New Jersey would pass laws that let religious speakers and politicians speak, but not labor organizers. And she led those fights, devised the tactics that the union used in other places, and was wildly successful, and deserves to be recognized for that. She has not been. She's been written out of that history. She also led several defense campaigns for Wobblies who would be imprisoned for either speaking or organizing outside of the free speech fights to raise money and call attention, get them legal representation. During World War I, which the U.S. joined in 1917, she was arrested. She had violated the Espionage Act. So in April, Woodrow Wilson takes the United States into a war to make the world safe for democracy. Soon after that, he advocates for a law to silence all dissent against that war to make the world safe for democracy, including any dissent that basically would inhibit enlistment or recruitment for the armed forces or service in the armed forces, and any dissent that criticizes our allies, which means you can't criticize England. And there is a true fact, someone who had made a documentary, the film industry was in its early years in the US, someone had made a documentary about the American Revolution, and they were indicted under the Espionage Act for portraying England in a bad light. So this law was serious. She was arrested for violating the Espionage Act, pleaded with President Wilson to not go to jail, not come to trial, and she didn't. And then instead of taking off for Russia, like her fellow Wobbly Bill Haywood did, he jumped bail and went to Russia. She stayed in the U.S. Her family was there, her son was there, her life was there. She was no longer married, but her life was there, and formed the Workers' Defense Union. This was a civil liberties organization dedicating to fighting for anyone, no matter your ideology, who was arrested and jailed for labor activism. You may recognize some of the names of the people that the Workers' Defense Union fought for. You may not. One was Marie Acquey, an anarchist, anti-war activist, out lesbian, I already said she was anti-war pacifist. Another was Nicola Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti. You probably heard of them. Eugene Debs, probably another familiar name. Emma Goldman, Alexander Berkman. Lovett Fort Whiteman, a black communist, or so people whose names are familiar, but people whose names aren't. And she was very adamant about we need to fight not just for the people with an organization and name recognition behind them, but for everyone, because oppression lands on everyone who advocates for the working class. She organized against deportations. She fighted for safe and sanitary conditions for prisoners, those slated for deportation or just imprisoned because of violating the Espionage Act. She gave material aid and comfort to families. She supported independence movements as the head of the Workers' Defense Union, right? Because you could get arrested, remember, for saying anything against England. So the Mexican independence movement, the Indian independence movement, the Irish independence movement, all of these activists were ones for whom the Workers' Defense Union went to bat. And were she around now, or were they around then? Protesters for Palestine absolutely would have been supported by the Workers' Defense Movement. She'd be sending money and aid to the Palestinians. That would be a cause I have no doubt that she would champion roundly. In 1920, while she was still with the Workers' Defense Union, she was one of the founders of the American Civil Liberties Union, the flagship civil liberties union in the U.S. And she was a giant of the civil liberties. Her name was on the masthead, and she and the recognized kind of father of the organization, Roger Baldwin, gave tours around the country talking about civil liberties. She was beloved. But that changed in 1940 with a rising tide of anti-communism. We're not yet in the post-war Red Scare, Cold War, but we're in what historians in the U.S. call a Little Red Scare. In 1940, anti-communist liberals in the ACLU were getting uncomfortable, but that the reputation of the organization was going to be tarnished. They wouldn't be able to do their fundraising. So they passed what's called a Communazi resolution, barring communists and Nazis from serving on the board. She was incensed at that she would be likened an anti-fascist, most of her adult life at this point, that she would be linked with the Nazis, and said, I'm not quitting, they'll have to expel me. And indeed they did. They voted and expelled her by a vote of 1, and part of the tragedy was they never told her the results of the trial. She had to ask friends. That's how insulting they were to her, and that it happened very shortly after her son, Fred, died of cancer. In the 1950s and 60s, she continues her civil liberties work, defending the rights of communists and all Americans. For her, how we treat communists was a litmus test for how we treat political activists generally, to hold their own views and join political organizations nonviolent of their own choosing. In 1961, as part of this Cold War Red Scare, her passport is revoked, along with other communists. All right? And she's pretty upset about that. In fact, she publishes an article in the Daily Worker, the newspaper of the CPUSA, titled, Why Can't I Go to Ireland? Saying, President Kennedy can go, all these other people can go, but I can't, and I should be able to. And she writes what I think is a brilliant piece in Political Affairs, a theoretical journal of the Communist Party, called The Right to Travel. And I'm going to read an excerpt from that for you. Because if she had not prevailed, in fact, she did prevail. She and Herbert Aptheker, another party member, sued, and their case went up to the Supreme Court, and in the decision Aptheker versus the United States, it was declared unconstitutional for any law to bar Americans from traveling based on their politics. Had she not prevailed, I would not be here speaking to you right now. I might not be able to be here speaking to you in 6 months if the government of the U.S. prevails, but we have Flynn to inspire us, so we'll fight back. Flynn's article offered a spirited argument against any political litmus test for U.S. citizens who wish to travel abroad. That I am an American citizen is indubitable. In common with other citizens of the U.S., I have the right to expect the Secretary of State to issue a passport in my name when I request it for purpose of travel. My opinions, and even more, his opinions about my opinions, are quite irrelevant to this right. A passport, Flynn observed, is not an indication that one held acceptable ideas. Quote, the passport serves only to identify me, to make plain my citizenship, and to request formally and as a matter of civilized behavior that the nations I may visit receive me with ordinary courtesy. Flynn also noted how the right to travel was bound up with other rights. Freedom of movement is necessary, she observed, to the exercise of basic rights of expatriation, emigration, and asylum, as well as scientific research, cultural exchange, and peaceful relations between and among nations. So Flynn's work was important. She empowered people, not just because of what she did, but because of what she empowered other people to do. One of the things that I draw out in the book is how she sparked conversations about civil liberties. What is free speech? When should we have it? When should it be curtailed? What does the First Amendment mean? This is called popular constitutionalism. And she inspired these conversations among working class people of every ethnicity, every language group, every gender, every race around the US. And she encouraged them not just to talk about their rights, but to fight for their rights. Not necessarily to rush and get a lawyer, to get out there and speak, to get out there and organize, to petition, right? So to play their own role in the fight. And it's hard for people in the US anyway to believe that a communist would fight for freedom. And Flynn has been erased from US historical memory largely, except for among radicals, because of the Cold War. But I think she deserves to be celebrated. She's a complicated figure. She was indeed blind to the faults of the Soviet Union. She wasn't, as some people have tried to make her out to be, a feminist. She would never have, like most radicals of her era, she would not have called herself a feminist. She was not a suffragist. It's been said that she advocated for suffrage. No, she, in fact, in her wobbly days, she thought that she called suffrage, a distraction. What am I going to do? Say to poor, starving women on the picket line, go vote next time around. Maybe somebody will get into office who's going to give you a better deal. Right? In fact, she herself didn't even vote. Suffrage was passed in the U.S. for women in 1920, white women largely, right? She didn't vote until 1937 when she voted for Fiorello LaGuardia for mayor of New York. P.S. Anyone following New York politics, she definitely would vote for Zoran Mamdani if she were around now, right? She had a lesbian affair with Marie Aquis, that period where she was a closet wobbly. For 10 years, she was in Oregon at the home of Marie Aquis, nursing wounds after her lover, Carlo Tresca, who I mentioned earlier, cheated on her with her sister while they were all living together and had a son. That's the guy, her nephew, who started City Lights Books. So she had this long-term affair with Marie Aquis. Was she a lesbian? Well, after she left Marie Aquis, she had affairs with men. So her sexuality is complicated. She's not someone we can put into a particular category. But even though she wasn't a feminist, right, or a lesbian activist, she did have a lot to say about women's rights, particularly working class women. She advocated for birth control, equal pay, job training, federally subsidized childcare, which we do not have in the U.S., and she articulated the triple jeopardy thesis in 1948. Angela Davis has praised Elizabeth Gurley Flynn for being among the first white women to recognize that working class black women are exploited as black women and working class people, right? Before anyone else, I think in large part because of her friendship with the black communist Claudia Jones, who is a terrific influence on Flynn and vice versa. So she didn't see the fight against racism and sexism as outside of the fight for the liberation of all working people in all nations and at all times and all places. She died September 5th in Moscow on one of her trips to the Soviet Union after her passport was reinstated. Never made it to Ireland. Her ashes are there, some of them, but the rest of them were brought back to the U.S. They're buried in Chicago next to the Haymarket Martyrs and some other heroes of the U.S. radical labor movement, I think, where they belong. When her son died, she posted a memorial in the Daily Worker. To him, the night, to us, the fight. I think we can say that about Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. To her, the night, to us, the fight. The things that she fought for are still things that we need to fight for today. As I mentioned, the struggle in Gaza, the struggle for Palestinian liberation, the struggle in the U.S. for free speech. We have Americans now worried that their cell phones are going to be confiscated at the border when they travel and they might be detained. Her passport fight then remains relevant. I think everything that Flynn fought for remains relevant, and her life teaches us, I think, that you need to fight hard, but you also need to recognize that the fight never ends. Thank you. 1964. A year after my birth. I like that my life and hers overlapped for 1 year. I'm outing myself here. Yes, I could have. I'm convinced my Irish-American coal mine, she loved coal miners. I'm convinced they met her, but I didn't. I wouldn't remember anyway. So, yeah. Questions? Comments?
I'm intrigued by her autobiography. he also wrote an autobiography, and it's interesting what she does and doesn't include in, and the way that she's described. Did you find that when you were researching her?
So the question is, does her autobiography, that she wrote an autobiography, so what kinds of things does she include or spin in there that I found interesting or helpful or maybe not so? So yeah, she has an autobiography. It's the first half of her life. It was published while she was in prison. She was imprisoned at the Alderson Federal Penitentiary for Women, a beautiful place, but as she said in her prison memoir, because she did write a prison memoir after her experiences at Alderson. A prison is a prison, no matter how great it looks. And I'll get to your question in a minute. I encourage you, if you've never read the Alderson story or the reissued version, as My Life as a Political Prisoner, it's interesting. There's some, she's got some kind of very dated views of the world in there, but she's also got some very current views, like this idea that drug addiction is not a moral failing, it is an illness. The idea that prison populations are largely non-white and exclusively middle class, and that prison is a tool for oppressing working class people, particularly marginalized working class people. She and Claudia Jones desegregated the prison after the order to desegregate came. Oddly enough, they turned to the communists and said, could you help us because you have all this experience with desegregation. She wrote an article about 4th of July for the prison newsletter, so that's a really interesting book. Her autobiography. So here's the deal. I'm a rhetoric professor also, so one of the things I think that you need to keep in mind about autobiographies is that they're rhetorical. Autobiographies are written because you want to present yourself in a particular way. So she wrote her autobiography while she was a communist, and she was always talking about, I need to carve out the time to write the second half, which may have kind of framed the first half a little bit differently, right? So she writes the first half of her life before she became a communist, from the status of being a devoted communist, right? So we have to keep that in mind. Any doubt she might have had about the party, toward the end of 1926 and et cetera, she wouldn't have articulated. And she was a good comrade. So any disagreements she would have had, she would not have articulated to have them, be used against her comrades. And it's very much, if you read it, a work-focused book, right? I mean, she mentions her personal life, absolutely, it's woven in there, but it's really about her career, her public career. So I think I looked at the autobiography with the idea that this is Flynn framing herself a certain way. And I regret that I didn't have a second half to look at, but she kept getting called back into civil liberties work. I mean, she would write, I really just want to go to San Francisco and write the rest of my autobiography, but I have to defend all these comrades who keep getting tossed in prison because of all the repressive legislation in the US, right? So, but she didn't edit it. She wasn't particularly happy with the final version because you can't edit your books prior to publication when you're in prison. She didn't like the title. It was changed to The Rebel Girl. But they published it as I Speak My Own Piece. So she saw problems with it. She really always was bugged by it. But I think you need to look at autobiographies for your subject that way. They're presenting themselves a certain way. Having said that, there's lots of stuff in areas in here where I quote her. In part because she's just got such a great way with words, but also in part because it's her way of looking back on things that she did. But I think one needs to be careful. It's not an explicitly completely factual record, right? It's a spin. But for Flynn, it's a spin for good reason, I think. Someone had a follow-up.
I almost answered it because it's one of my favourite political memoirs. I've read it a few times, and she just fascinates me. I just love her. Just love her more, and I love it that time. But actually, the book, first time I read it, I just thought it was most exciting, blah blah blah, and then next time I read it, I was like, not that it's made up, I didn't mean that, but so she wrote it much later in her life, and she's remembering back. She's not kept diaries of her life, because there's bits in it when you're reading it, you go, it doesn't hang right, if you know what I mean. The bits when you feel, I don't know if that did happen like that, or not seen in the background, but it makes sense that she's writing it in the 50s and going back and thinking of her when she's a girl and the excitement of that, and that I've always stated in that book that when she's pregnant and she's speaking and then they start throwing stones at her when she's out pregnant, she's not bothered about her belly and things like that. And another bit where she goes to Joe Hill, and I don't know if this is true, but I like the story to Joe Hill, where she's trying to convince him that he's to disclose that he's shot by his lover's husband, but he's a comrade and he doesn't want his shop on the comrade and all that. And I don't know if that was ever, if that is true, or it's trying to put Joe in a good light, or a testimony that she's created a story for him later on. I don't know. I like the story, but I always felt our memoir was like, I always wondered if there was another part of the memoir, if you know what I mean. But I think you've answered that. I'm quite looking forward to reading a book, because then it's not just her story, it's your story about her, and that might fill in things as well. Does that make sense?
And of course, I'm completely unbiased.
Me too. But I'm not putting it, I don't want to say anything bad about it, but you know what I mean? There's bits in it I'm like,
So the question, or the comment, right, with the question, yeah, is that reading her autobiography, I found my kindred spirit. Sorry, my husband's here, but I found my soulmate in the audience, right? That it's a great read, and you really love this woman, but then you start thinking, oh wait, did that really happen? And was that, yeah? Okay, a couple of things, yeah. So she's, remember, she's publishing this during the Cold War in the U.S. I don't know how it was here, but it was pretty hairy in the U.S. So she's being very delicate about what she's going to say about whom. The other thing is that now she did keep some Tamiment library. It's not Tamiment anymore, but there's a radical library at New York University. There's a radical library at New York University, and that has her papers. She did have a lot of notes to look back on, a lot of letters from friends to look back on, and she actually did in her column. So she wrote a column for the Daily Worker for years, and even then she'd be like, do I really still have to write this column? Like, yes, you do. You have to keep writing it. We need you. She was a good comrade. And she asked people, hey, any of you who've known me from back in, I'm paraphrasing, from back in the day, and if you have any, letters that we wrote, or mementos, or stories, write to me, or come and visit me, because I'm writing my autobiography, and I need my memory. I'm a little getting on in years, and I need my memory refreshed. And I would encourage, I know that in England, I think the communist newspaper is the Daily Worker, right? Or now it's the Morning Star, but the U.S. Daily Worker, if you like Elizabeth Gurley Flynn, her columns are wonderful. I mean, there's things like where she's saying, I'm getting a little chunky. I need to, I'm all of you out there who need to watch your diet. I sympathize. I mean, it's like this incredible mix of personal things, like memorials to her son, with critiques of the law that is, going to land all these radicals in jail, and you might want to look at that. It really gives you a kind of a sense of, and people just loved her, and they responded, and sent her stuff, or presumably met with her. So it's not like she wrote it and it was so far away that how could she possibly have remembered that? She did have and keep some diaries, and she talked to friends. And I think for some of those stories, if she had outright lied, I think somebody would have said, that didn't happen. I know, but I'm saying, if she had, right? If she had embellished a bit too much, I think somebody might have called her on it. But she's got a reason for writing.
I want to give a big hand to Marianne.
Oh, you're finishing?
Yes.
You want to ask just one question?
Yes.
Okay. Just do it. So 1950s, Hungary, the tanks into Hungary are moved from the IWW, so Anarchos and Victor's position, into the American Communist Party. Her involvement and her support for the Abraham Lincoln Brigade, her knowledge of what happened there, and the Stalinist behavior in Spain. I'm just wondering how you can a little bit how you can deal with that. It's quite a big issue. I suppose being a comrade in these days under the capitalism, to stand as a comrade was to stand with Joseph in a sense. You know what I mean? How do you feel about that now? The Stalinism, the crimes of Stalin, the crimes of the Stalinists in Spain, of the shift from anarcho-syndicalism to traditional, almost Mormon style
Yeah, she would have. So people say she would have joined in 26, but they lost her application. I think there was all this infighting in the party at that period, and she really was put off by it. But I think by the time she joined in 37, it really was the only train leaving the station, and they really were doing incredible things in the U.S., right? Organizing. You didn't even mention the first thing that really bothered U.S. liberals anyway was the Nazi-Soviet pact, right? Here was this dedicated anti-fascist, and then the Nazis and the Soviets signed a non-aggression pact. She still is an anti-fascist. She doesn't officially shill for the Nazi-Soviet pact, and she doesn't officially come out and advocate against fascism, but she kind of does, right? She never stops in her really taking aim at the fascists. So she retains some of her, she remains a dedicated anti-fascist for the rest of her life and sees the Soviet Union, flaws and all, as the biggest opponent of fascism once the pact is nullified by the invasion, right, the German invasion. The 1956 and Hungary, she's in prison when she learns about Stalin's crimes. She's all by herself in prison. And please bear in mind that the CPUSA, correct me if I'm wrong about this, but they're the only communist party to publish in their newspaper disagreement about this, to criticize, and she doesn't take a position while she's in prison. And then when she gets out, when there's this movement to kind of reorient the party towards a more independent course, kind of distancing themselves from the Soviets, she doesn't take an official position. However, by not taking an official position against this kind of effort to reform the party, she's essentially siding with the status quo of the party, and that's what ends up happening. And she just, that's why I said, like, she's complicated. She's not, I mean, I have to be critical of her for that. I mean, she's, she actually runs for office to show that we're still a legitimate party despite what's going. She's at one point, I think I call her in the book myopic to the point of disillusionment. She's just convinced that like this stuff is, not as bad as it seems, and Americans are the working classes are gonna realize that despite its flaws, the Soviet Union is, really the best hope we have for freedom and democracy and the best bulwark against fascism, and that just wasn't gonna happen. So she was blind, and also she didn't want to lose her comrades. People report leaving the party and being really, really alone. Steve Nelson, one of them, a veteran of the Spanish Civil War, really great guy, left the party. I think it was after Hungary. He left the party, and the only person who came to visit him was Elizabeth Gurley Flynn. I mean, you left the party, you were like the people who had never been in the party unless you were willing to turn into a real jerk and go after your comrades. They wanted nothing to do with you, and the people who were in the party, you left them. So she also had that. She was an older woman, and this was her world, her life. I'm not making excuses for Stalin, but I'm just saying she just couldn't or wouldn't see it, and her comrades, being part of the movement. She just focused on Italy and France and other places, because by this time, there was a lot. The Italian Communist Party, she was always hoping the U.S. Party would do what the Italians did and kind of chart their own course, but then she didn't join that movement in the U.S., so I don't have a simple answer for that.